Well, I hate to be the guy to break up all this good chat around the table, but I'm going to do it anyway. I could hear the tidbits of great discussion from around the room, and I know at our table we certainly had some good chat, and I don't even need to, it would be a very safe wager to say that you could ask anybody that question that we were just turning around at the tables, and as many people as you'd get that many different answers to what, causes anxiety to come up and what it feels like in us. Because everybody's experience with it is different, and that was certainly the case around our table. What are the different things that make us anxious? What it feels like, what's going on in our brain, what's going on in our bodies. And here's my interest in this. I'm an anxious person myself, always have been. It's been a lifelong challenge for me about as far back as I can remember into my childhood. And then I've been a pastor for 7 years, and I've had a lot of conversations with people who have this same struggle. And many of you know I spent the last few years working on a master's in counseling, and it's been eye-opening just to discover how common the experience of anxiety and anxiety disorders, which is like anxiety on a whole other level, just how common those things are. So we've labeled this a holistic conversation today. So I want to talk about this from all of those different angles. I'm going to have my anxiety sufferer hat on. I'm going to have my therapist hat on to talk about the psychology a little bit. And then I'm going to have my pastor hat on, talking from a spiritual perspective. And the first thing I want to talk about is just the answer to this question, what is anxiety? So I'm going to answer that from the psychology and the neuroscience perspectives. And here's a strange truth. Anxiety is actually necessary. Anxiety is necessary. We need some anxiety because it keeps us safe. Our brains produce fear for a reason. If we're in danger, we want our brains to produce anxiety as a signal that we need to take some kind of action to return to safety. We can probably all resonate with the experience of having like a sudden fright about something and feeling that surge of adrenaline. I had one of those earlier today. I was at the grocery store and somebody in a pickup truck whizzed right in front of me as I was pulling out of my spot, and we just about collided, and the adrenaline kicked in, and I didn't even think about it. My foot went to the brake pedal, I stopped, and everybody was okay. But that's anxiety response. It's meant to keep us safe. Now, with my pastor hat on, I'd also add that I believe that God has designed us to have this response. In that light, this natural anxiety is kind of like it's a gift from God that we have in order to keep us safe when there's some danger. So I bet you didn't come here today and expect to hear me say anxiety is a gift, did you? But there comes a time when that natural anxious response, that gift from God, our designer, there comes a time when the response can be problematic. And again, in a nutshell, it becomes problematic when we've got something going on that causes that natural anxious response to get like stuck on, even when there's not any actual danger. And here's the example that I usually use for this. And this is funnier now because we've actually had bears running through town this year. But if a bear was to be chasing you up Queen Street out there, you'd want that natural anxious response to kick in, right? You'd want that surge of adrenaline to power your body to a hasty retreat from a bear. Although you got to know whether it's a black bear, brown bear to decide if you're supposed to run or stay still or climb a tree. I'm going to run. Where the natural anxious response becomes a problem is when it doesn't turn off. Like it's on even when there's no bear. And that can happen for a lot of reasons. You know, maybe the encounter with something like the bear has been so scary that we develop post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, or we develop like a phobia of bears. I have a phobia of large off-leash dogs because I was once chased by a pair of off-leash Rottweilers who wanted to snack on me. So I carry this anxiety about large off-leash dogs now. I'm not presently being chased by one, but just telling you that story, I can feel that anxiety coming up in me. Maybe we've got one or more just like ongoing stressful situations in our lives that feel unsafe in some way. Maybe we've had trauma like abuse in our past or in our present. And any of these things can get our brains used to keeping that anxious response turned on, just to the point where it becomes stuck on, or stuck in like a heightened state, and you feel like the bear is chasing you. I don't believe God wants that for us. Just looking at all of you, looking at the folks through the camera there, and just I want to say to you, I don't believe God wants that for you at all. I believe that God has given us a healthy anxiety response to keep us safe if the bear is chasing us up the street. I also believe that God, in God's love for us, doesn't want us stuck feeling like the bear is chasing us up the street when it's not. And that leads us to this question. What do we do when we have too much anxiety? Or when we have an anxious response that's stuck on? And I'm invisibly switching hats here again, but with my psychology hat on, as an anxiety sufferer, I can tell you that there is hope. Okay? There is hope. There are things we can do, and that journey will look a little bit different for each of us. And you can take this little nugget away with you to talk to your friends, your family, who might have been too anxious to come and sit in the empty chairs this afternoon. Chatting with your doctor is an excellent place to start. Because sometimes our brains, just like other parts of our bodies, our brains need some help with some medication. Maybe we might benefit from being referred to a therapist or a counselor. There's lots of different ways that a properly skilled therapist can help you approach your unique challenge with anxiety. There's all sorts of good natural products that can help. Exercise helps. Being outdoors in nature and taking in the sunlight helps. Spending time with understanding and supportive people helps. If you want to know more about any of these things, or if you have someone in your life that needs to talk about that stuff, my phone is always on, and I'd be glad to do that. But to take us back to the idea that we want to have like a well-rounded, holistic conversation about this, and given that we're a church, I want to spend a brief time talking about the spiritual component of this. You know, here at Bluewater Church, we say all the time that Jesus desires our wellness. When we read the stories of Jesus in the Bible, we see him consistently showing concerns for the well-being of people. That's the Jesus that we talk about every Sunday morning here. And that's the Jesus we talk about in groups during the week, a Jesus that cares about our anxieties. Did you know that Jesus once got so, I'm going to put the label anxious on it, so wound up with anxiety as he's approaching what was going to happen to him at the cross, that he bled drops of sweat. I've never been that anxious and distressed. Jesus has. But Jesus gets your anxiety. He understands it. There's an idea in Philippians chapter 4 in the New Testament that says, don't be anxious about anything. Yeah, I can see your smiles. Instead, pray about everything. Tell God what you need. Then you'll experience God's peace. Now, you might be wondering if some anxiety is there for our protection, and if it's designed that way as a gift from God, what's up with that sentence? Don't be anxious about anything. Instead, pray. Some of this has to do with the specific situation that the author of those words was addressing. And that's always how we deal with the timeless principles that we find in the Bible. We figure out what the specific situation was, and then we dig out to the timeless principle from that. And in this case, in Philippians 4, the situation was a bunch of bullies. I can tell you from childhood experience, bullies cause anxiety. What the author is getting at here is not that we shouldn't have anxiety when difficult things happen, like being bullied by some people. It's that we don't need to resign ourselves to being stuck, dwelling on those anxious feelings. The author of Philippians proposes a solution. He says, pray about it. In other words, go and talk to God. We just said Jesus understands anxiety because he experienced it. What's better when you're feeling crummy in some way, like being overly anxious, and being able to sit and talk to someone who's had an experience with that, who just gets it? Because Jesus is God poured into human form and had that experience, you can go and talk to him about all the anxiety in the world, and he understands. We do much better with that stuck on anxiety when we have someone to unpack it with. God can be that. And here at Bluewater, we're organized around a model of building relationships, in part so that we have other people to talk to. We think that is so important because it does help. Because we believe that community is another one of God's gifts to us for that reason and many others. So this is why we're gathered around tables today. Because we really do believe in the value of doing things like this in community, of learning from one another. You'll learn things at your tables from one another that you won't learn from me standing here talking for another hour about this. I'm not going to do that. So we're going to take the next 20 minutes or so to learn from one another. There's a few questions on the sheets at your table. Take some time, share your thoughts, listen well to others, and then we'll come back and wrap the afternoon up.